In this episode, we're going to talk about Rich Man, Poor Man, and Lazarus times 2. Here we go. All right, in this part 2 episode for this week's Come Follow Me, we're going to focus on Luke 16 and 17 and John 11. Now, remember that Jesus is speaking with primarily the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's kind of going against them as he gives these teachings through these parables that really include the Pharisees and the scribes. He's describing them usually as the rich people, and the fortunes that await them are very different than what they might be thinking. And again, all the way through these Lucan parables from chapters 12 all the way up actually through 19, we get this spiritual economy. We get this idea of rich and poor and money. And he continues that on here with the parable of the unjust servant in Luke 16. We're going to pass over that for the sake of time. And I want to go down and make this one point here before we move on with the parables. Down in verse 13, he says to the Pharisees, "No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." This becomes very important in the rest of these parables. Remember who he's talking to. He's talking to the Pharisees. And he's saying that you are acting as if you serve God, right? You're supposed to be serving God. You are in a position of power here. And yet you are not serving God. You are serving mammon, or the devil. He's saying you can't do both. And it's such a true point. You have to make a decision. And sometimes maybe we think we're serving God, but we're hanging on to something else that might hold us back. And that's the point of mortality, or one of them, right? As I see it, is that we have to be able to have these decisions that are forced upon us in the environment that we live in. And inevitably, these things come up. What are we going to decide? How are we going to arrange our values hierarchy through not only our belief system, but even more importantly, through the way that we live? Who are we going to serve? And in every case, there's always something where we have to lift one principle above the other. We have to make a decision that lifts one decision over another, or one consequence over another, one outcome over the other. And we can't serve both. You always are in a position where you think you might be able to sometimes do both things, but inevitably the situation puts us in a place where we have to make a decision. And the Lord is saying here, Jesus is saying here, you can't serve both. Eventually, you have to pick in every circumstance. Eventually, you have to pick who you're going to follow. And so he's speaking here with the Pharisees, and he goes back to another parable about the rich and the poor. And this parable is fascinating. This is the parable about the rich man and Lazarus. A lot of parallelism in here. But before we get there, I want to go to the Joseph Smith translation, because this becomes very important. In the Joseph Smith translation, again, as we've talked about in the previous episode and at other times, Joseph Smith inserts quite a bit here. And what is he inserting again? It is all about them focusing on the law and the prophets as a dead law, and not bringing in what it really has looked forward to, which is him, which is the Son of God, which is the Redeemer of the world. And I'm going to read a few of these verses here because it gives us another idea of the change that is happening, what Jesus is really trying to restore here, the doctrine that has been lost. He says here in verse 16, "And they said unto him, We have the law," these are the Pharisees, "and the prophets. But as for this man, we will not receive him to be our ruler, for he maketh himself to be a judge over us." So again, they believe they've got this law, the law of Moses. It's all that they need. It doesn't look forward to anything else at all It's all about merit. It's all about their actions. This is really interesting, too, at the very end of this, where they say, we will not, but as for this man, we will not receive him to be our ruler, for he maketh himself to be a judge over us. Who does that remind you of? How about Laman and Lemuel over Nephi? Where Nephi, they're saying that Nephi wants to be a ruler and a king over them. This is the same distinction. This is the same thing that's happening. This is a direct parallel to the beliefs of Laman and Lemuel. They are like the Pharisees. They do not believe in what is coming. Remember that they are righteous in their minds. They believe that the people in Jerusalem at the time of Lehi are righteous. This is exactly what the Pharisees are saying. They don't believe in the higher law. They don't believe in the coming of Jehovah as the Son of God. That's my belief. And that's what had happened to Jerusalem at the time of Lehi. The exact same thing here with the Pharisees. Strong parallelism there that I can see. And then in verse 17 in the Joseph Smith translation, it says, Then said Jesus unto them, The law and the prophets testify of me. Yea, and all the prophets who have written, even until John, have foretold of these days. So why does he need to repeat this to them? Why don't they believe this? Well, we have to think about the circumstances that they're in. They have a Bible. It's called the Septuagint. It is held up as a great translation. It's the Greek translation of most of the major books of the Old Testament that the Jews have at this time. But it's not specific enough. And in fact, after the rivalry between Judaism and Christianity starts to peak a couple centuries later, the Jews actually say the Septuagint is a horrible book because there were even yet too many references to the Messiah and the Son of God. They didn't like the language of it. And so they got rid of it. And they went later on to what we have today, which is the Masoretic text of the Old Testament. But even in the Septuagint that they would have had at that time, a lot had been removed centuries before. A lot had been removed about the coming of the Son of God, who was the Messiah. Look at the Old Testament now. The Messiah is barely even mentioned. I think there's one or two direct references to a Messiah. In all of, I think one's in Daniel, that maybe one in Isaiah, I'm not even sure. But it's almost non-existent. Now, they believe in a Messiah. They just don't believe in Jehovah, in God coming down to earth and being the one who suffers. So here he's saying, they have all prophesied of me, whether you believe that or not. And then down in verse 20, this is the entire verse is inserted here. It says, And why teach ye the law, and deny that which is written, and condemn him whom the Father hath sent to fulfill the law, that ye might all be redeemed? Right? So again, they don't understand the Scriptures. They don't understand what they have. There are allusions to these things that we can still see in the Old Testament, but much had been removed, and they did not understand what the Scriptures foretold about Jesus. 21, O fools, for you have said in your hearts, there is no God. So we can see here that secularism, as it always does, has reared its ugly head here with the Pharisees, at least in part, during the time of Jesus. And you pervert the right way, and the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence of you, and you persecute the meek. And in your violence you seek to destroy the kingdom, and ye take the children of the kingdom by force. Woe unto you, ye adulterers. So in the next chapter, there's a reference to the Pharisees offending the little ones, the children. And so I don't know exactly what that's referring to, but it doesn't sound good. And so he's coming after them full bore here and their way of teaching. If you go through the Joseph Smith translation in the New Testament, it's interesting. He's even more forthcoming against the way of life and the teachings and the doctrines and the ideology and the power of the Pharisees, Sadducees, high priests, scribes, etc. And then he follows this up, and this leads us into the parable. He says here at the end of verse 23, "Verily I say unto you, I will liken you unto the rich man." And then that leads us into the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And in the regular book of Luke, outside of the Joseph Smith translation, we pick up this parable here in verse 19 of chapter 16. It says here, "There was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day." I'm going to go through the whole parable and then we'll come back to it. "And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died, and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And beside all this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot. Neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. Then he said, I pray thee therefore, Father, that thou wouldest send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, lest they also come into this place of torment. Abraham saith unto him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, Nay, Father Abraham, but if one went unto them from the dead, they will repent. And he said unto him, If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. Interesting end point. So let's go back up here and analyze this a little bit. This is really very interesting. Again, there was a certain rich man, no name given to the rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen. So this would be almost royalty or maybe priestly, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus. This is the only character in any of Jesus's parables that is actually given a name. And here it is, Lazarus. And a couple of important things to understand here where we can look at some parallels. Number one, Lazarus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Eliezer, which is the name of the servant of Abraham. Now remember, in the story of Abraham, before he is able to have a son, have an heir, all that he has is going to be given to his servant, whose name in Greek is Lazarus. But then he finally has Ishmael through Hagar, and then later he ends up having Isaac through Sarah, through a miracle. And so Lazarus, as we'll call him, the servant of Abraham, he is a Gentile. That's important to understand here, and does not actually receive the inheritance here. He was designed to receive it, but he doesn't receive it. Isaac has it ultimately, right? And so here we have in this parable, again, the two names, the two people of Abraham and Lazarus. There's a parallel here. I'm going to keep going. And so there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Now, this is really interesting. There is no other author of the Gospels that writes about this parable. But in Mark and Matthew, they do give the example, not a parable, but the example of the event of Jesus traveling to Phoenicia, which is basically Lebanon, to Tyre and Sidon. And there a woman in one She is listed in Mark. She is I think it's in Mark. She's a Greek. She's a Syro-Greek. And the other she's listed as a Canaanite, or a woman of Canaan anyway. And so she's listed as someone who would be a non-Jew, a non-Israelite. And if you remember the story, it's very quick. Jesus is out there. She asks him to come and heal her daughter. He says, wait until the children are fed. They're eating, and you have the crumbs which fall from the table, and the dogs eat of the crumbs. And here you have another example of this, where Luke does not write about this story, but he does write about this parable. Again, she was a non-Israelite, and here you have Lazarus, who, if we tie him to the Lazarus of Abraham, also is a Gentile. And Luke was likely a physician, a Gentile physician, who wrote mostly for the Gentiles. And so he's using a different example here than what Mark and Matthew used. Interestingly, in Mark and Matthew, or at least in one of the two of those, as they write about the example of the Canaanite or Greek woman, that's where it's specified that Jesus, his mission is to the Jews, at least first. But here, Luke is going to be doing the opposite, where he is talking about what would be then a mission to the Gentiles. So we can look at this in a way where likely we have the rich man who is a Jew who calls Abraham his father, and Abraham calls the rich man his son. And then the Lazarus is more than likely would be a Gentile here. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. Okay. So, in other words, the rich man does not go to Abraham, but the poor man does. The poor man, who would be possibly a Gentile, goes to Abraham's bosom. Now, this is pretty interesting. There is a parallel to this parable in Egypt, where there is the story of Setme and his son, who is Sire. And it's very similar. It has a lot of similarities anyway. But the interesting thing is, to me, is that as they talk about in that example, in that story in Egypt, they talk about not going to Abraham's bosom, but they do talk about going to the place near Osiris, or a place right next to Osiris. This is important because there are numerous ties that we have found between Abraham being used and as an example in Egypt of Osiris, the god Osiris. And if you look at the facsimiles, you see Osiris laying on the lion couch about to be sacrificed by the priest of Pharaoh, but Joseph Smith says that it is Abraham. Of course, in one of the Leiden papyruses that also has a lion couch scene, there is Osiris laying on there to be sacrificed, or someone to be sacrificed toward Osiris. And there is the name of Abraham written right on that page in a lion couch scene, a sacrificial lion couch scene. Then in 23, and in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water, and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. Then in 26, and beside all this, between us and you, this is Abraham speaking to the rich man, there is a great gulf fixed. Of course, this is doctrine that we know of in our church, that there is a gulf. There is a spirit prison and a spirit paradise. And here they talk about this gulf. Now, this is written about, this gulf in the afterlife is written about in the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is not in the canonized scripture. It wasn't found until centuries later, In fact, I think in the 19th century. The first version, I think, in Ethiopia was found. And they found another one, too, in one of the Eastern Bloc European countries, I believe. But this was a doctrine from the Book of Enoch, where there was a gulf that would divide the just and the unjust in the afterlife in kind of a waiting period, right? They call it Hades here. We say hell here, but the Greek is Hades, where they're kind of waiting in this area where there's a chasm between the two of them. And they're referring to this book of Enoch, which is referred to several times. The language of the book of Enoch is used several times in the New Testament and actually has a direct quote in the book of Jude. And then in verse 28, the rich man says to Abraham, I have 5 brethren, that he may testify unto them, being Lazarus, lest they also come into this place of torment. And Abraham saith unto him, the rich man, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Very interesting. Remember that Joseph Smith in the translation here just above has just been talking about how the Pharisees have the law and the prophets. They have Moses. The Pharisees are saying that. We have all of this. And here, this is being referenced in the parable, where Abraham is saying, hey, they've got Moses and the law and the prophets. Let them listen to them. And here now, the rich man is saying, no. Basically, I think what he's really saying is that's not enough. They don't understand it. They don't understand enough about mercy and the higher law and the Melchizedek priesthood, and that Jehovah is the Son of God, who is the actual Messiah. So again, as with Abinadi, that's all they have is the law. It is dead to them. And Abraham follows up again and says, look, if they have Moses and all the prophets and they're not going to listen to them, they're not going to understand what's actually being said there, they're out of luck. So again, Luke using the idea of the poor and the rich and kind of inverting this reversal of fortunes in the afterlife, where the Jews, if they're following the way that they're following things, are not going to be on the right side of that chasm and are not going to go to Abraham's bosom. But the Gentile, the poor Gentile who has lived a righteous life, will go to Abraham's bosom. Another thing that's interesting here is that when we talk about the law and the prophets here, that the Pharisees say that they have, and that Abraham talks about, notice that the rich man talks about Lazarus going to preach to his 5 brothers. A number of scholars have said that, perhaps what they're looking at here are the 5 books of Moses, and that that's what's not enough. It's the law of Moses here being taught through the 5 books of Moses are not enough. Another thing to look at is that the rich man, clothed in purple and regal or priestly, perhaps it's Caiaphas, who is the high priest. He is the son-in-law of Annas, or Ananus, also called Ananus, whose 5 sons, were also high priests. And so you would have Caiaphas and his 5 brothers or brothers-in-law that were all high priests and all needed to be taught more about what Moses and the law of Moses really were trying to teach, which is about Jesus Christ. Regardless, it comes down to the law of Moses and the books of Moses being interpreted in a way that leaves a dead law without looking forward to a higher law and to the Son of God taking on the sins of the world. And then over in chapter 17, just quickly, we have the story of the 10 lepers. And remember, Jesus heals them. One comes back after he's healed. And Luke, of course, mentions here that he is a Samaritan. And so the one who was grateful was a Samaritan. And the other 9 never came back. So Luke is careful to point that out. And of course, that's what the New Testament eventually becomes about, right? The gospel, the kingdom of God, is built by Jews to start off with. Jesus and the apostles and many others that are converted in the land of Jerusalem and Galilee and others. And then, of course, very quickly with Paul, spreads out among primarily the Gentiles. And so the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So then we jump over to John chapter 11, and here we get the story of Lazarus. Again, now this is a different Lazarus, or is it? It's kind of an interesting scenario here, where actually in Come Follow Me, they've coupled these two stories together from different Gospels. But here we get the story of Lazarus of Bethany. He is the brother of Mary and Martha. Martha's the one with the home where Jesus comes to at the time of Easter, at the time of Passover, his last week alive, where Mary anoints him. And here, this hasn't happened yet, but here, Mary and Martha send messengers to Jesus, who's up north, teaching what we've been going over here, to tell them that Lazarus has died. And Jesus tells his disciples, once he receives the message, that he is only asleep. But the apostles understand that as, oh, well, he's going to be okay then. He's not really dead. Jesus has to clarify, no, he is dead, but it's okay. And he actually waits a couple of days before he heads down. And it's 4 days before Jesus arrives in Bethany. And Martha runs out to him to see him and meets him and tells him what is going on. And if you had only been here, then he would have been okay, because probably he could have been blessed by him when he was really sick before he passed away. But Lazarus is buried in a tomb with a stone put over it, just like Jesus is in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And so he comes in and he asks them to remove the stone. They stop him and say, well, wait a minute, it's been 4 days, he's going to stink. And Jesus says, go ahead and remove the stone. And interestingly, similar to the way Jesus is buried, he is completely wound up in clothing and has what they call a napkin over his head or over his face, similar to Jesus, where this is the shroud that was covering his face. And Martha has said to Jesus, he says, I know that if you say that he will rise from the dead, that he will rise from the dead. Here's what she says. I know that even now, 4 days later, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. We get always these examples of faith. And so it's not just that he wants to put out these miracles for everybody to be converted. He's acting on the faith of others, typically. And of course he's going to act on that faith. And it always is brought out in the Gospels that there are people of faith that are asking for these miracles to happen. And Jesus responds to her saying, thy brother shall rise again. And Martha says to him, well, I know he's going to rise again in the resurrection at the last day. By the way, a clear reference to a physical resurrection. And Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. So we've heard that many times, that verse. That is in reference here to Lazarus being lifted up. And he asks Mary in verse 26, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? So he is confirming her faith. And she saith unto him, yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ. Here's the qualifier. Remember, the Christ is the Messiah in Hebrew. I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. Luke is very specific, as is Mark and especially John, in talking about who this is. Not just some warrior, not just some king, but the Son of God who would come into the world or be born into the world. And so the way that Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead is once they go in there, he says with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot, with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. And so many are converted from this. I mean, it's a pretty big deal, right? Many are converted from this. And so many of the messengers go from Bethany, which is just less than a couple miles from Jerusalem, and go back to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the high priests, Caiaphas and tell them what has happened. And they're like, this is it. We've got to tighten down the screws here. We've got to take him out. We've got to take Jesus out. And this is an interesting point here. We're going to end with this. Caiaphas says this to everyone once they've received this news. He says, consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. So they already know that they're going to sacrifice him, right? They know that that's what they're going to do. This is not a surprise to anyone, and this is why Jesus is supposed to stay away from Jerusalem, especially at the Passover when they have the crucifixions. And so they know this is going to happen. This isn't something, this was the plan. This isn't something when Jesus gets taken that night and then crucified the next day that was a whim. And this is a way what we're going to do to him. They knew what they were going to do. Caiaphas knew he had to take out Jesus. It was getting out of hand. Too many people were converting, and they were going to lose their power. And so then in verse 51, and this spake he not of himself, being Caiaphas, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. So he knew that was going to happen. It also brings up kind of a principle, strangely enough, that we can look back to with Nephi and Laban. Remember what the Lord says to Nephi. It is better that one man should perish, I'm paraphrasing, than a whole nation dwindle in unbelief. So something similar here. Caiaphas is saying, we're going to take this man out for the good of the nation here. So a perverted example of sacrifice that Caiaphas is giving here. They're planning on crucifying the Son of God. Imagine. And then Luke adds on to this, and not for that nation only, because he wants to talk about the Gentiles, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. So everybody, the Gentiles, the Jews, everyone. Then from that day forth, they took counsel together for to put him to death. They knew what they were going to do. The plans were laid in dark and in secret. And then in verse 55, this could have been a while later. It could have been even months later. But it leads us into what follows next week. And the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand, and many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. So with the raising of Lazarus, now the stage is completely set for Caiaphas, the high priest of the temple, the man in charge, to take out the Son of God. And they know how they're going to do it. I'll talk to you next time.